kill her. She even pointed out to a friend at one time that if she ever came up missing, to look for her in the new timber. So that's the part that's so extremely disturbing to me. If I had a friend that said, hey, if I come up missing, this is exactly who did it and exactly where I am, I think I would be figuring out an escape plan for them. But it didn't seem like they actually took it seriously. It was more like kind of a joke. I don't know at this point how seriously they were actually taking it, but they knew that Todd was actually capable of doing these things. They believed that. One of her friends actually described Todd as, quote, a person you don't mess with, end quote. So that alone tells me that if you actually believe that he is somebody that you wouldn't mess with, then you know he's capable of something that you don't want to see. Amy also had a conversation with her brother that month, stating that she would want to leave and that she was asking for help in finding an apartment. And he was also willing to help store some furniture for her. So as soon as the crops were out of the fields, she was planning on leaving and they were going to file for a divorce. On November 6th, Amy went in for a uterine ablation procedure, and it was kind of an in and out procedure, just an outpatient surgery that day. And so by the morning of November 10th, Amy was outside doing some work on the farm with Todd and their 13-year-old son, Tristan. I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll discuss more of the incident that occurred on November 10th of 2018. Hello, we are back, and now I'm ready to discuss with you what occurred on the day of November 10th. So remember, Amy had just had the uterine ablation performed 4 days earlier on November 6th. There was testimony that Amy was still experiencing some bleeding at this point. Amy had made breakfast for Todd and Tristan as they set out to work on the farm that morning, sometime around 9 to 9:30 a.m. According to Todd, they were preparing for a delivery of piglets, and Amy had really wanted to go out and help them. That morning, her friend Carrie texts her, quote, how's it been going? Been thinking of you guys. 1 minute later, Amy's response reads, quote, thanks. Okay. Still very tense around here. Just not sure of anything anymore. And that would actually be the last text ever sent from Amy's phone. So what do we think that means? What do you think that was the tension that was happening? Because she had just gone in for this procedure, and according to Todd, everything's fine. But according to her, things are tense. And so I'm not really sure what that's about. But unfortunately, we will never really know Amy's side of the story. Todd said that when Amy got ready to go out for work, he suggested that she go try to clean light fixtures in the barn. And so she's up on kind of buckets and things like that to reach these light fixtures. And she's reaching up and she's cleaning them. And he describes how she keeps getting dizzy. And so she's coming down and she's kind of grabbing herself and just feeling really dizzy and needing something to hold on to. And Tristan keeps asking her, are you okay, Mom? And she tells him, yes, just dismisses it. I'm fine. I just keep getting dizzy. So they both kind of at some point try to convince her to go inside, but she wants to stay outside and she wants to help. So instead, Tristan brings up to Todd that they do need this pet carrier out of the red shed. And so Todd says, yeah, Amy, that would really help us out if you would go get this pet carrier. And the pet carrier was just kind of a small pet kennel, and they were planning on putting some kittens in there so that they wouldn't get run over by the heavy equipment that they were going to be using that day. And so Todd notices after a while that he hasn't seen the pet carrier yet and that Amy's not back. So he sends his son Tristan to find his mom, and so the 13-year-old goes off and he goes to the red shed to find his mom. Now, to describe the setting a little bit, the red shed, if you go into the door, there are things in front all the way, and so it's a very, very narrow spot that you can actually walk through as you walk through the door to the left-hand side. And as he walks into the red shed, he finds his mother, Amy, lying face down on her hands and knees on the ground inside of the red shed with a corn rake sticking out of her back. He immediately screams for help. If you are unfamiliar with a corn rake, this has to be such a horrifying experience for this boy. It's a very, very sharp, heavy-duty farm tool. It kind of looks like a pitchfork. It has 4 prongs, and they're typically very sharp, and they're very rounded. They're rounded more than a pitchfork is. And as you can imagine, accidents do happen on farms, that this is definitely kind of a freak accident that you would never think of happening. So instead of calling 911, Todd goes, he finds her, and he takes out the corn rake from her back in order to get her out of the shed. He tells them eventually that there just wasn't room to get her out because it is such a narrow space that he had to actually get the corn rake out of her back in order to get her out of the shed. So he puts her in the truck and takes her to the hospital. During this time that they're on their way to the hospital, Amy is actually seated on 13-year-old Tristan's lap. He's just holding his mom like a child, and she is probably bleeding, I'm guessing, although that wasn't said. I'm guessing there's a lot of blood, but he is actually holding his mom, who is at this point is not responsive. And like I said, Todd had already removed the corn rake, and he's on his way to the hospital. As he's on his way, he frantically phones 911 as he's racing down the road in his truck, and they instruct him to stop and try CPR. And he does that, but Amy is not responding. Todd says during the 911 call that there is actually foam coming out of her mouth. And according to a medical examiner on Nancy Grace, he said that usually foam coming out of the mouth would be caused by pulmonary edema or lungs filling with fluid because of heart failure. It could mean that the forks have hit the lungs also, and they are filling with blood possibly as well. So obviously they are going to need to investigate this, and an autopsy was performed immediately on Amy. The medical examiner almost immediately calls it a homicide. But how would they know that from the autopsy that it was a homicide? Because it appears that it's just some sort of freak accident. Well, her body, the wounds actually told a different story. Blunt force injuries were found on Amy's face, knees, and hands, and wounds that were determined to be defensive wounds. When they investigated her injuries, they also found that she had 6 puncture wounds across her back. And how would there be 6 puncture wounds with only 4 tines on the fork? It's important to note that also the 6 puncture wounds were in different directions. There were 4 facing one way and 2 facing at a different angle. So that would actually mean that instead of one sole incident, she had been impaled with the rake twice, possibly 3 times. There were a couple of drops of blood where he reported her to be found, but other than that, there was no visible blood in the red shed where Amy was found at all. In February 2019, Todd Mullis was arrested for Amy's murder. Todd maintains his innocence and says that he was not aware of the affair at this time, and Tristan told police that he was with his dad that entire day. So, after having his trial being delayed 4 times because of COVID, which we saw a lot of 2020 and even in 2021, Todd's trial finally took place in the fall of 2020. The star witness, unfortunately, for this entire case is their 13-year-old son, because he was there when all of this happened. Can you imagine the trauma that this poor child has been through all of these years? And there are even some sources that allege that Tristan knew of the affair all along, and he had been scared for his mom. There would end up being some cracks in Tristan's story. So when he immediately said, "No, I was with my dad the entire day," that wasn't actually true. There were some times in the morning that he wasn't actually having eyes on his father. And it was a big farm. I mean, these barns are huge. It's a big area. And so I'm sure there were times that they weren't actually seeing each other. So there were a couple of times that Tristan would leave to get water in the office toward the front of the barn, and he admits before the trial that he was gone for maybe less than a minute each time initially, but then during the trial he actually testifies that he doesn't know how long he had been unable to see his dad. So the story kind of keeps changing, and he's really unsure at this point. Now, Tristan says that he never saw any blood, his father's demeanor never changed throughout the day, and prosecution would argue that Jerry had just as much of a motive. And if you think about it, he truly did. I mean, he had the same motive, and really he had access to the farm. So who's to say it couldn't have been Jerry, right? And the defense argues that there simply wasn't enough time for Todd to actually accomplish this without Tristan having noticed or without having something go wrong and not being noticed. So they kind of want to create a doubt that it could have been Jerry. Jerry had actually spent the entire morning 45 minutes away that day with his college-age son, and so his son was also his alibi. They were doing work and watching college football that entire day, and they actually had cell phone records to back up those claims, so he was pretty much dismissed as any person of interest. If Amy and Todd were to split, his entire life, though, would be split in half. The farm would be split, he'd be paying child support and possibly alimony, and they argued that that was plenty of motive for him to want Amy to disappear. The prosecution actually played the 911 calls, and they argued that during the chest compressions, Todd can actually be heard stating something like, quote, cheating whore, end quote, and, quote, go to hell, cheating whore, end quote. Whether or not he actually does say this is a genius move on prosecution's part. When he's questioned about it, Todd states he cannot hear anything and he doesn't recall what he actually had whispered. That alone instills reasonable doubt in the jury, and that's all they need. So that was a genius move on their part to actually create the doubt that Todd was actually saying those things, and Todd had absolutely no defense and no idea of how to back that up. They bring up during the trial the fact that Todd and Amy hadn't actually shared a bed in the last 5 months. They also bring up, as I said, that she had defensive wounds and she had bruises on her knees. That could arguably be a sign that she was possibly in a fetal position during the attack. There were also searches on Todd's iPad that were linked to his Gmail account that was killing unfaithful women, what happened to cheating spouses in historic Aztec tribes. He had also researched the placement of organs in the body. What could that possibly mean? So to me, that means that he's researching the best place to hit someone to kill them, because he's researching what organs to hit. And he had also searched things like, was killing more accepted centuries ago? Characteristics of cheating women? Did ancient cultures kill adulterers? And gaping chest wounds. The medical examiner on Nancy Grace states that Amy would not have died instantly from her wounds. He said that depending on what was actually hit, she would have hemorrhaged internally and it would have taken several minutes for her to bleed out. She would have also been in excruciating pain from the rake stuck in her back. Todd was actually found guilty of murder in the first degree, and he was led out of the courtroom in chains. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and before he left the room, however, he did proclaim his innocence one more time. So that is the story, folks. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will be back with our Spotlight of the Night. Thanks. Hello everybody, this is tonight's Spotlight, and tonight I thought I would do another domestic violence story since that was our topic this evening. So this is a story about Gina, Shaun, and Joshua, and this is from a website called www.g-s-j.org, and I am going to be reading it word for word, of course, as I do all of the Spotlight stories. So it says, Wednesday, June 9th, 1993, our son-in-law poured gasoline in the living room, up the stairs, and right into Gina's bedroom, lit a match and walked away. Walked away with not a burn on his body, walked away with no carbon monoxide in his lungs, walked away while our daughter and 2 grandsons died in the inferno. And then when you click on to meet Gina, Shaun, and Joshua, it says, I have a story to share, a story about my 26-year-old daughter, Gina Marie, my 3-year-old grandson, Shaun Edward, and my 7-month-old grandson, Joshua Lee. They were murdered in an arson fire in Jeanette, Pennsylvania on June 9th, 1993. My son-in-law has been found guilty of this dreadful act of violence and is serving 3 consecutive life sentences. All this, 4 lives totally destroyed because of domestic violence. In 1993, 135 people died as a result of domestic violence in Pennsylvania. Gina, Shaun, and Joshua, they were 3 of those murders. This same year in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, where the crime took place, 7 people died as a result of homicide. Gina, Shaun, Joshua, they were 3 of those homicides. In fact, when the local paper did their year-end highlights, it reported the following. The coroner's office investigated 7 deaths it classified as homicides. Of those victims, 4 were male and 3 were female. 2 of the male victims were boys classified as 10 years old or younger. Shaun and Joshua,